Welcome back to Smitty's Learning Room. Today we continue to have a look at the HSC sports medicine option, and we're looking at the focus question: what role do preventative actions play in enhancing the well-being of the athlete? So previously we had a look at the physical preparation and what role that plays, and today we're going to have a look at sports policy and sports environment and what role do these play in enhancing the well-being of the athlete. So when we have a look at where it comes from in the syllabus, as we said before, it comes from the focus question: what role do preventative actions play in enhancing the well-being of the athlete? And the previous video we had a look at physical preparation, so things like pre-screening, skill and technique, physical fitness, and the concepts of warm-up, stretching and cool down. In this video we're going to focus on sports policy and the sports environment. So again, there's lots of different things that contribute to enhancing the well-being of the athlete, and today we're just going to focus on this concept of sports policy and the sports environment. In future videos we'll have a look at environmental considerations and taping and bandaging. So let's start by having a look at the importance of sports policies and the sporting environment. And so when we look at policy, that's like something that's put in place. It's almost like a law that has been put in place. And so governments, sports clubs, associations need to provide a safe sporting environment. And therefore these policies identify hazards which put the athletes at risk and allow for the management of such risks. So you'll see, especially in the sporting scene, that a lot of policies should cover the maintenance of playing fields and equipment, coaching and staff qualifications, first aid and duty of care, codes of conduct for player, coaches and spectators, and risk management and injury prevention. So if there are policies that exist around these concepts, then we should have a safe sports environment. So when we're looking at sports policy and the sports environment, there's 5 things that we need to focus on, and they are the rules of sports and activities, matching of opponents, modified rules for children, the use of protective equipment, and safe grounds, equipment and facilities. So these 5 things are the 5 things that you need to be able to know about for this part of the focus question. So we'll start by having a look at the rules of sports and activities. So last video we talked about the concept that sport and risk go hand in hand. So if we're playing sport, there's likely to be risk evident, and obviously with an increase in risk we're going to have an increase in injury, and so therefore we need to put rules in place to help decrease injury and increase the safety. So for example, we'll have sports that are usually sort of high contact sports or that have striking implements. There are usually quite strict rules around those games. And so for example, a sport like hockey, you aren't allowed to lift your stick above your head to hit the ball, because obviously that's quite dangerous if there's a runner coming in for a tackle or something. If we look at rugby league or rugby union, even AFL, we need to look at the concept of spear tackling, and obviously there are high penalties and concerns around spear tackling, and athletes are obviously taught not to do that because the penalties are quite severe, and not only about penalties but also can cause quite significant harm and injury to the player who is being tackled. Now obviously when we look at the implementation and the management of these rules, the umpires are responsible for ensuring that these rules are put in place and they're adhered to throughout the game or the performance. Now, while the umpire is there to control the game and to ensure that the risk is kept to a minimum, if an umpire loses control of the game for some reason, this is obviously going to increase risk, and that's why there will be policies around the rules and the accreditation of umpires to ensure that they can apply those rules to enable that the safety of the game is ensured every time. So the next concept we have a look at is modified rules for children. So obviously if we were to put an under-8s AFL team on the field, and a full-size field, and they would use full-size balls and they were able to use full-size goals, etc. Obviously, one, it probably wouldn't be a lot of fun for the kids, but also there would be a greater chance of injury. So we apply modified rules to decrease the chance of injuries among athletes, and that could be the type of playing surface that they're playing on, the size of the equipment that they're using, and also the rules, like contact rules, the size of the playing field, and sometimes the length of time which children play for is often modified to decrease the chance of overheating, because as we know from previous videos that thermoregulation is an issue to look for in young children when coaching them. And obviously that shorter time period can also decrease the chance of overexhaustion. And obviously making the game more enjoyable for all the athletes by making it more accessible means that we're going to have an increase in participation. Some examples of sports which use modified rules, and most sporting bodies in New South Wales will have modified games, are Auskick, Mallee cricket and Netter. Now these rules are generally changed to ensure that the safety and the enjoyment of the game still remains, but they're also learning basic principles of the game for when they get older and progress through different levels of that sport. So for example, netball in Netter, their 3-second rule is obviously not adhered to, and it's changed a lot. The concept of not being able to step is different for Netter in that players are allowed to sort of move a little bit on the spot, and this also allows for the enjoyment and increased participation, but also decreasing injuries from young people having to stop and start suddenly. And when we look at the modified rules, usually it's a concept of shorter periods of play, a smaller field size, smaller and lighter equipment, and obviously of low impact and contact. So games like rugby league are most likely to become dragon tag or Oz tag, where players aren't making full physical contact in a tackling motion. So the next aspect of sports policy and sports environments is matching of opponents. Now, there's lots of different ways to match opponents, but it's really important for sporting clubs and association to match players according to their ability, weight and height and age. Now, usually sporting teams in the younger years are done on age. Sometimes now that some associations have weight categories as well, because teenagers or young people who are going through adolescence tend to do this at certain times, which can allow for different heights or different weights, different body sizes. And so obviously if we match opponents fairly in this aspect, we're going to have an increased level playing field. So it means that it's a fair playing field for all athletes, or for most athletes. And because of that, it's going to decrease the amount of injuries that are happening. And it will also allow for skill development. So if we're matching opponents with increased ability with other people who have an increased ability, that's obviously going to increase their skill development as well. Now, a concept of progressing skillful players is something that you see quite often. You might see, for example, an under-14s soccer player might play up in the under-16s to try and increase their skill level, or to try and increase their opportunities for making representative teams, that sort of thing. But it's essential that when that happens, that needs to be done gradually to avoid injury and allow for effective skill and tactical development. If we allow players to progress too quickly through skill development phases, often they can miss key elements of learning that skill, and it's very difficult to try and change that habit later on. The next concept is the use of protective equipment. Now, protective equipment is designed to do one thing: to decrease risk and injury. Now, protective equipment changes a lot over time depending on what sort of research comes out to say that, this equipment works, this equipment actually has no impact. An example of that is headgear in rugby league or rugby union. You tend not to see headgear as much by professional athletes, but still see it amongst younger athletes. It's quite common. There are other sports where protective equipment is essential. So for example, cycling, it is the law that you must wear a helmet when in New South Wales, when riding a bike, on the road, footpath, in a race, on a trail or anything. Another great sport that's a good example is cricket. So obviously cricket players have lots of protective clothing. So if they're batting, they'll have a protective helmet, protective gloves. They might even have an arm guard or a thigh guard, and they will also have obviously batting pads as well to protect themselves from the speed of the ball, either coming at the lower or the upper body. Mouth guards obviously for high contact sports, shin pads for sports like soccer and hockey, obviously to stop the impact of a hard hockey ball or the impact of studs from an opponent. Another use of protective equipment, which isn't actually equipment that the athlete would wear, but you often see around football goalposts or netball goalposts, is just a padding there in case athletes actually hit that post. And obviously, especially in sports like netball or rugby, where they're close to that post quite often, obviously if it's padded, it's going to decrease the chances of injury. So the final aspect we look at in relation to sports policy and sporting environments are safe grounds, equipment and facilities. Now this obviously has a lot to do with the sporting environment, but there's still policies that will govern the upkeep of these grounds and equipment and facilities. So grounds, equipment and facilities deteriorate over time. They're going to decrease in quality, and sporting associations, clubs and councils are responsible for the maintenance of these facilities. Obviously, if we have a decrease in the facilities and equipment, we're going to have an increase in risk. So things like weather can quickly change the quality of a playing surface. So for example, if you've got an outdoor netball court and it starts raining, that court's obviously going to get slippery, and this is why we need to have risk management policies in place, which ensures that the club or the association has inspected the equipment and the grounds prior to use. So when we have a look at a couple of examples of safe grounds, equipment and facilities, obviously things like cracking and holes in the ground are very dangerous, especially for grass sports. So if you're playing rugby league or soccer and there's cracks in the ground or there's holes in the ground, this is obviously going to cause injuries of soft tissue nature definitely, and possibly of a hard tissue. Things like a game of tennis, if we've got a net that's deteriorated and it's got holes in it, not only is it going to make for an unfair game because the net is not in correct condition, it can also cause harm to an athlete. If an athlete runs into it and it's not pulled tight, this could cause injury to the athlete. Another example is things like basketball or netball hoops. If they're not directly upright or if they've sort of become rusted over time because they're outdoor equipment, this can become quite dangerous and obviously needs to be had a look at before the game begins. So a lot of information in this video, and there's still a lot to cover under this concept of what role do preventative actions play in enhancing the well-being of the athlete. So now what we've had a look at is we've looked at the physical preparation and how can we better physically prepare an athlete to sort of decrease the chances of injury and illness when performing or when participating. And in this video, we've had a look at how sports policy and sports environment can ensure that we decrease risks in the environment, in the sporting environment, and implement policies that allow those risks to be decreased so that we have a safe environment for all players, from children's all the way through to adult. We will continue to look at this focus question in future videos, where we'll start to have a look at, well, how can we consider environmental considerations and taping and bandaging to enhance the well-being of the athlete.